Hey, everyone. My name is John Frechette. I'm the founder of Sourced Economics. We are a group of economists, some from business and some from academia. And what we're trying to do really is build a research function to support customers in tackling everyday business problems with solutions that are really grounded in economic research, academic papers, and similar types of work. And what I'd like to do here and in the future videos, there will be probably a few of them, and we'll do a little bit of a series, is to give you a sense of the work directly. So, a typical academic paper is somewhere around 20 or 30 or 40 pages, generally has some very advanced math and statistics techniques, and, lots of Greek letters. And so the process of actually combing through these, pulling out useful insights for, in this case, supply chain professionals, it's a super niche thing to do. And so you can think of this a little bit like a product demo. So just kind of a demo of the work, and hopefully you'll take something useful away from it as well. And it should be an interesting discussion. And so I'm excited to be joined here by the author of the paper that I want to go through. His name is Dr. Zhang of State University of New York. Dr. Zhang teaches courses in materials management, management science, operations management, forecasting, and he teaches at the Oswego School of Business there. And so he's done some really significant work around supply chain and logistics and inventory planning. And so, Dr. Zhang, great, really awesome to have you on. Thank you for, providing edits to this deck beforehand and helping clarify some of the stuff, and looking forward to hearing your insights. So thanks a lot for joining. Feel free to clarify and correct on anything throughout, but great to have you on.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to jump into the actual kind of presentation here. And on my screen, you'll see on one side is the actual kind of paper. And we'll go through about half of the paper. We'll pull out some key insights. And then on the right side is the actual presentation that pulls out some of the key formulas and data points. And we should be able to also take some insights out of it. So starting with the introduction, and I'll just scroll down here. Generally, the introductions will start with contribution to the literature. And I'll let Dr. Zhang comment on this after and sort of, again, clarify anywhere it's needed. But the contribution to the literature that Dr. Zhang was fleshing out here relates to the fact that there's been significant coverage on intra-chain topics. So that is how one sequence of a supply chain interacts with another through a product's manufacturing life cycle. But there's been very little that's been done, and I'll highlight this piece. There's very little that's actually been done on looking at supply chain versus supply chain competition. So that is at how many different supply chains interact. And of course, that is much more aligned with the world we operate in. And so if you have multiple supply chains, what does the competition between them look like? What determines the winning chain? And then one thing we'll cover, pretty in depth is what determines the actual equilibrium state. So I'll go through a couple more slides and then pause for your feedback, Dr. Zhang. Significant time is dedicated in pretty much any academic paper on the actual framing of the model. So that is the author's assumptions about which variables are changing, which are constant, how different concepts are defined, and other data points that help us to better understand and visualize the analysis. So a few we'll pull out here. One I'd like to just cover right up front is the definition of equilibrium in this model. And again, we'll talk about this more in depth, but equilibrium here is defined as the state where winning chains are those with the lowest total marginal cost. And so, for example, all of the chains with a marginal cost above the minimum will be fully inactive, despite maybe those resources being available to be turned on. And we'll talk about, what that means. The second aspect here I want to talk about, and something we'll refer to throughout, is that there are different activities throughout the supply chain that we'll refer to, and that Dr. Zhang refers to as links. Links come in two forms. One is an operation link, and operation links represent substantial business functions of a firm. And so, that's, for example, procurement teams issuing an order, a firm manufacturing a product, transporting a pallet of supplies, And so that's the operation link piece. The second type of link is an interface link. And interface links are really the coordination function between two successive operations. So for example, that relates to kind of information sharing and production coordination and concepts like that. The transaction costs between a couple of business activities is part of the interface link. And so, for reference, an operation link participates in multiple supply chains or can, and an interface link is generally chain specific. For the purpose of this report, most of the focus is on the operation link, which is good for us because it produces some really actionable results. But of course, the interface link is a very important concept as well. We can talk about a little bit. And then maybe the last assumption I'll call out here is that the cost functions, which we'll also talk about in depth, those incorporate not only price and monetary costs, but also ineffectiveness issues like delivery time and quality issues and stuff like that. And the last slide I'll cover before I take a quick pause is the actual structure of the model. And so in this case, we can see that, very quickly, a supply chain economy is a network of interrelated supply chains that are involved in producing multiple related products, in delivering those products to kind of multiple different end markets. So the model captures both intra-chain coordination and interchain coordination. The supply chain itself is a family of coordinated M chains, and each M chain or market pertinent chain, I'll just kind of highlight that section right here. Each M chain is a network of coordinated business activities for delivering one particular product to one particular end market. So in a single supply chain, you'll have many different M chains for various end consumer markets, but you'll have similar assemblies and they're coordinated in the same production process. So, I think maybe the final point I'd make here is, in this context, supply chain management can really be thought of as the study of coordination of flow of materials and information of a company's various M chains. So that's, a lot of information, but the framing is important. And with all that framing in mind, Dr. Zhang, anything you'd like to add or clarify to sort of those few slides I just went through?
Yes, particularly on this hierarchy of supply chain economy, supply chain, and M chain. We can think of this. Supply chain of these three, supply chain is, I think, most people at least hear of or familiar with. But as we can see in this model, I break down the supply chain into the actual functioning M chains. Like I would like to call it like my arms and legs. These are my M chains. The whole body, all right, myself is supply chain. So through these M chains, I compete with another supply chain at a particular product for a particular product and a particular market. But I can compete or interact with another supply chain with another arm, all right? But the whole body, I coordinate of these, my arms and legs in here as my M chains in the production, in the procurement, in the economic scale that I can save my cost and better functioning. So I can be more healthy in a sense, the whole supply chain. And then supply chain compete with other supply chains or interact with supply chain on this platform of supply chain economy, if that helps.
No, I think it does. Now, one specific question I have, and it actually just kind of came to mind, is the M chain a relatively new innovation in the literature, or have the distinction between supply chains and M chains, or is that something that's a concept that's been around for a while?
Very good question. I think I introduced the called M chain. Maybe there's one paper in front of before this paper has been mentioned, but in another context. But basically, it is the first concept I introduced in this paper, M chain, market pertinent chain, because I need these M chains to actually characterize the competition.
Yep. Okay. All right. That makes a lot of sense. And I think hopefully that's good framing for getting into the actual model here.
And by the way, the supply chain economy is the concept brought forth by this paper at first.
Got it. Okay. That's good to know. Good acknowledgement. So with that in mind, let's get into kind of what I view as the most foundational model and really just a starting point, which is your network model. So here's how Dr. Zhang basically represents the supply chain economy as a whole in its most basic form. I'll just highlight that piece right there, which you can see on the slide. Really simply here, a supply chain economy is a function of the actual number of participants or agents and the number and makeup of the links. And so a kind of derivative of that, we've already discussed that the links are made up of both operation links as well as interface links. So the operation links, as a reminder, that's your actual procurement and manufacturing and other activities. The interface links is more or less the transaction costs between multiple operation links. So, much of what's done in these equations and in kind of mathematical economics in general is starting with a basic equation, breaking it down further and further, ultimately getting to a statement that's in some respects highly logical, but laid out in a way that allows us to start to think about its properties. So something like this, very simple, but we can already start to think about what it means in its kind of most basic form. So pulling out a little bit of intelligence, you can infer here that in supply chain economies with high transaction coordination costs relative to even distant substitutes, once again, that's your interface link, the activities of single firms and individuals become more critical to remaining competitive. So for example, if you build a new plant or offshore team in a different country where language barriers might come up, which increases your transaction costs, reduces interface link effectiveness, you can expect that you'll face some significant disruptions to your supply chain and that you should be investing, in this case, in maybe some really excellent supply chain professionals or certain types of software that help you kind of bridge this gap or other kind of investments like that. And you should be considering this for a range of variables, not just language, of course. So once again, let me pause really quickly. Does that all make sense to you, Dr. Zhang?
Yes, perfect.
Okay,
yes.
cool.
If these two operate at different countries, not only the language barriers or cultural and political systems, instability, things like that.
Yep, makes sense. So that's maybe the first portion. And next we'll move on to what I might just call kind of a single operation links production function. And I'll highlight that one formula. We don't have time to walk through a significant amount of this language, but highlighting that one formula. And what I tried to do with the slide was break down the variables into their simplest forms. And so, pick out what's relevant, put it all together in a way that makes sense. And I'll just call out specifically what we're measuring with XA, or what Dr. Zhang is trying to measure with XA, is the amount of output associated with basically an input, which in operation link. So the different variables involved included are kind of the total output for the market pertinent chain, the M chain. In this case, we call the M chain S. This is an independent variable for output. And the next variable, lambda AS, is the amount of work per unit processed by that link for that particular chain. And so, you can see in the equation below, just for illustrative purposes, the role of the lambda AS is to take total output and put it through a filter to pull out what's actually required from operation link A specifically. So that's how much of A is required to produce a single unit of a product. Now, the other one here that I don't actually include, and maybe Dr. Zhang, you'll want to talk about this a little bit, but that is your delta AS. That is what Dr. Zhang calls the operation link chain incidence matrix. And the reason I didn't include this, just for simplicity, was that it's going to be either a 0 or a 1 based on whether the M chain produces is active in the actual, based on whether the operation link is active in the M chain. And, for this analysis, I just assume it's 1 and I leave it out so as not to complicate things. But again, maybe Doug, is there something else? Does that make sense to you to simplify the equation, marking that as a 1?
That's true. That's good. Yeah, we don't need that until necessary. I mean, the delta AS. if in mathematics, because we put in the general form, then we need this delta AS to include all these market chains, whether or not they use this particular operation link. You're right.
Got it. That's okay. Perfect. Glad that was a reasonable simplification to make. And, so bringing it all together, you can see that output for a single operation link, that is a single business function like manufacturing or something similar, that can be found by taking the summation of the total output of the supply chain or M chain, multiplied by the amount of work required to actually produce each unit in that M chain by operation link A. So once again, it's actually very logical and intuitive, but we can use these statements to really pick apart variables and ideas. And so let's get into the insight slide, and then I'll welcome your input once again. What I want to call out here is that a greater volume in a particular supply chain or M chain will likely result in loss of productivity of the resources in that chain, but they'll vary in how much productivity they lose. So what determines which operation links, that is machines or plants or workers or other inputs, lose the most efficiency is a function of the market structures of the industries that supply them. So let me quickly, why is this the case? Well, when the volume of N chain increases, M chain S, so that's excess there, the operation link A will be used more intensely. So the principle in economics of diminishing marginal product tells us that efficiency will therefore decrease, and your lambda AS will therefore, the effort required to make each unit, it will increase. Now, I guess maybe a quick note for any economists watching, you'll realize that I'm making a couple assumptions here. One is the assumption of constant returns to scale. So basically you can imagine this as a Cobb-Douglas production function. And I'm also assuming that the other operation links remain unchanged, given that they're not part of our model. So, in alternatively, maybe you could say instead, I'm assuming decreasing returns to scale across the board. Regardless of these assumptions, it's not as much just the directional change of productivity, but the nature of the change that's useful to keep in mind and insightful. And so what I mean by that is you have likely productivity losses for operation links inputs, but this happens to varying degrees. With respect to your upstream materials, those are the supplies you're putting into your product, your cost of goods sold, or maybe it's, consulting services or something similar. For those upstream materials and supplies produced in highly competitive industries, productivity losses will be less significant and vice versa. And the reason for this is pretty simple. With more substitutes and greater competition, your manufacturing plants that are producing less effectively will be substituted out, pretty quickly. If there's just a couple suppliers, let's say it's a, natural monopoly utilities provider or electricity provider, then there's going to be less incentive to improve on their part. And also the switching won't be as seamless or kind of cost effective on that part. So therefore, lambda AS increases significantly in concentrated industries upstream and to a lesser extent in more competitive industries. And so, what does this mean practically? I think there's good practical application for decision making, but also, it's in diagnosing major problems. If there are some significant issues with one particular division, they have an abnormally expensive supply chain relative to competitors, lack of agility, issues with productivity. This would be a good data point to have to try to identify the root cause. So there's a lot of proprietary analysis in that particular slide. Dr. Zhang, once more, anything that you would add to that? And do you feel like that's kind of an accurate interpretation?
I think it's what you well said, well put. Yeah. I think when a particular operation link participates in more M chains, and then this operation is more stable and has a better chance to survive or prevail in the supply chain competition. Because as long as it participates in any winning chain, it will get contracts in this sense. Okay, got it. And so in some respects, that is
assuming increase in returns to scale as well. Is that right with the operation
Right.
link A? Got it. Yep. Yep. That's interesting. Okay. Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense. And it's really, I mean, in some respects, it is thinking about operation link and operation links in the M chains against which they're actually pumping out product is a little bit like thinking about factors of production and output in a typical production function. Is that right?
Yeah, well, one thing I probably want to add is we call it supply chain disruption. This is a very big issue, very big issue. But the whole story, lots of long stories I don't want to include here. But to be short, if say one operation link has participates in two market chains, one is big, one is small, right? Producing the same material. But if the big one had the bigger M chain has a problem, then or bankrupt or collapse, then it's taking away all its contracts or production volume. Then it will significantly impact the small chain, the other M chain that has a relatively small volume on this operation link, because this whole operation link will collapse.
That is an incredible segue because I think that is much of what we learned from the actual cost functions as well, in the sense where, a spoiler alert for the next slide is that, the cost associated with producing a product for a particular M chain out of a particular operation link is also dependent on its producing products for other M chains. So it seems like a really nice segue. I'll just quickly scroll down into these two cost functions. And then you'll see we'll come to actually a very relevant conclusion there. So, moving on to costs and the cost functions, CAS in this first formula is the cost on operation link associated with M chain S. And once again, we'll kind of break down what this means practically. But what Dr. Zhang concludes is that the cost of a single factory producing a single product is a function of the actual volume of that particular product within the M chain being produced, but it also relates to the total amount of all of the different products and supplies and services being produced by that operation link A. So this relates to the production function we just looked at to some extent. Your cost to produce a single good or supply is not just related to your production of that supply, it's related to your entire portfolio. So what I'm talking about right now for reference is not kind of total cost of the entire M chain, but it's the cost of producing a single unit of product A, which correlates with your lambda AS. The second line is trying to calculate total cost for the entire M chain S. And once again, this formula is really simple. It's basically saying the total cost of the M chain S is just the sum of all of the operation link specific costs for that M chain, as well as the summation right here, the summation of the interface links for that chain. So once again, maybe you'll correct me on the terminology here, Dr. Zhang. That's treated more or less as exogenous or external to the model, the kind of coming up with the cost for the summation of cost of interface links. But just for reference, the major factors that might affect the interface link would be things like geographic distance, past cooperation experience, level of information integration, and stuff like that. Anything else you want to add in about the interface link?
I think you're right. Mostly they are exogenous factors of the model, right?
Okay, but it is a hugely important concept, and it determines the effectiveness of the overall M chain, a pretty significant determinant.
That's true. So we leave it there for specific implementations. When we have looking at a particular problem, then we can calibrate and to make the model complete.
Yep, makes sense. And so, the insight here is actually fairly simple. And I mentioned it at going through the model. We can blow through it pretty quickly, but it's really that cost changes are really only partially related to your supply chain teams, processes, and people on a particular product, but they're also related to external changes in M chain or supply chain volume more broadly. Sometimes could be even external to your own company. So for example, as it relates to a single company, this might be kind of obvious, but if you want to expand your portfolio, you should really have a strong understanding of how that will influence your existing capabilities, because they're not separate issues. Even if you set up a new business unit that seems entirely separate from your existing kind of operations, they are still very related concepts. So I think this one's nice and intuitive, but does that make sense to you as well, Dr. Zhang?
Yes, very much.
Okay, cool. And so here's, I think, the last concept we really want to walk through. And, undoubtedly, in this analysis, we, just because of time constraints and stuff like that, we have to gloss over a little bit. And there's a ton of great content left in this paper, but this is the last item. I wanted to cover the equilibrium state. There's a kind of a long list of theorems and math equations that surround and provide proof for the equilibrium. And I've kind of sporadically included some of them here. I'll publish the deck so you can look at these, and I'll link to the paper as well. And I'm sure the specific language here, Dr. Zhang has some thoughts on and comments on, but really I'm just picking out a sample of conditions. So how does equilibrium hold up if you, introduce changes in quantity? How will it change with changes in costs? Those are the types of questions that are answered in these theorems. So, one example would be this first equation that's basically saying that supply chain output will not sustain if an operation link produced at a level between 0 and equilibrium quantity. And, the reason is equilibrium is where all winning chains operate at their lowest total marginal cost. So you're either producing equilibrium quantity or you're shut off and inactive. I think the sort of theorems covered here, if you're interested, you can take a look. Otherwise, most important, in my opinion, is kind of figuring out, well, if equilibrium is a pretty theoretical tool used by economists and mathematicians and other professionals, what is the actual application for business professionals? Is there any application? And, my interpretation that the answer is yes. The concept of equilibrium is meant to serve as a starting point for theory. And so for almost any type of research on equilibrium, you can generally pull out some interesting directional insights at the very least. So, illustratively, if equilibrium operates at a point of perfect competition, and if you can establish some of the characteristics of, equilibrium and of the firms in these models, then that gives you some interesting, useful information about the characteristics of firms that operate in highly competitive industries versus less competitive or more concentrated industries. And that's really what we're trying to do here. So in the case of equilibrium, we know all winning supply chains are those with the lowest total marginal costs. So, one example of an application of this is that in real world supply chain operations, we can infer that more variable products and services are inherently more variable than products generally. We can infer that those should be sourced from a more diverse group of suppliers. It's rational to do so. And the reason for this is that if you have a single homogeneous product, think of notebooks or water bottles or something like that, there will be a clear lowest marginal cost provider. So these are when it's, a real commodity. Based on the equilibrium condition, you'll have a clear lowest marginal cost provider. That supplier might change often, but you should still have a more concentrated supply base. Contrast that with highly variable services, for example. And on the surface, it's not easy to define the lowest marginal cost provider because the spectrum of different offerings within that particular supply chain economy is very large with many different variations, and that is many different M chains. And so the consulting services line item on an income statement compared with, cost of goods sold for a widget should be supported with a wider group of suppliers. And, once again, how is this practical? I think in many different ways. There's some useful information about decision-making as it relates to your supply base and how you should prepare your own procurement teams to deal with, for example, many different suppliers. And it's also a good tool for diagnosis, as I mentioned. If there are particular issues facing one division, this might be a good data point to have once again. So once again, Dr. Zhang, there's a lot of proprietary analysis in this slide also. And, how do you feel about this conclusion? Does it make sense to you?
Yes. Yeah, one thing I like to add is that on the previous slide where we have the mathematics are actually can be used to solve the problem, to actually compute all the chain flows, link flows, and to determine which particular firm will be participating a winning supply chain and how much the contract they can get in that detail level once the exogenous is given, once the parameters are calibrated. So we can actually compute so to show what your the insights, so all these variables and important things to actually put into computation.
Well, I love that because it just further highlights, it sounds like then each of these proofs or theorems or equations, each of them can actually be used to produce insights and produce useful intelligence. So that really kind of highlights the overarching story, which we'll talk about for a second in the closing, is that in the typical paper, there are an enormous amount of data points that if you can actually pull them out and make them useful and make them consumable, all of them are great data points of unbiased research to support a supply chain manager. So anyways, that's great to hear. So those are, I think, the key models and concepts to cover. Again, there's a lot more in the paper, but let me just kind of go ahead and make this full screen, and I'll talk for a second about the fact that Dr. Zhang's paper has been used and built upon for many years across a variety of subjects. Just last month, the economics department at Boston University put out a paper on the impact of trade policy on global supply chain network equilibrium, and it really relied on and used many of these topics. So I listed out some applications you'll find kind of here, and that you can find practical applications, but I'm hoping also overall you can get a sense for the breadth of possible use cases and additional research that can come out of just this single very awesome paper by Professor Zhang. And so I'll make sure that gets posted afterwards. And then, in closing, here we reviewed just a single paper, but our work at Sourced Economics generally encompasses a long list of papers on some select topics and challenges, and it's all brought together in an organized fashion, presented as kind of concise reports, what we call TLDR memos, too long didn't read memos. And I'm happy to give anyone some more information if you want to reach out via email or contact me on LinkedIn or something like that. So I want to thank everyone for listening to this recorded video. And Professor Zhang, I just can't thank you enough for giving me some great insights into the paper and providing some great conversations about it, and then also for joining the recording directly. It was just really awesome discussion, and I enjoyed diving into this paper. Great job.
Thank you for giving me the chance, and I'm glad my paper will be known by more people and be useful in practical work.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Zhang.
Okay.
And we'll talk soon. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.